Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Peculiar Stories, Volume 1, Story 1. In the early 50s, I lived in a strange old house located in Parkersburg, West Virginia. It was located halfway up Quincy Hill all by itself. From the time my family moved in that place, I felt scared, as though something watched me all the time. One cold morning, as I prepared for school, in the small bathroom, I glanced in the mirror and saw an old man with long gray hair glaring at me. I screamed and lost my balance as I turned to get out of the bathroom and fell on the heater. To this day, I carry an L-shaped scar on the back of my left leg as a reminder of that very unpleasant encounter. I also remember being home alone on a school day with the flu. I was feverish and decided to get some hot cocoa in the kitchen. I opened the cupboard door to get the can of Hershey's down. I felt something touch my shoulder. I dropped the can, and as I turned, I saw just the skirt of a long dress disappear out the porch door. Needless to say, I was glad we only stayed in that place a short time. Even my mother, who wasn't afraid of anyone or anything, never liked the house. I don't know if that house is still there or not. Story number 2. Well, you know, those cheesy ghost stories, the ones always involving some insane killer with a hook for a hand. Most people enjoy these stories and consider them nothing more than fiction. But what if I were to tell you that there are people who can tell true ghost stories, ones they have actually lived through? What if I were to tell you I was one of those people? When I was 12, my grandparents still lived at the foot of a mountain in southern West Virginia. They have long since moved away and are now living with my uncle. Back then, in school, children used to talk about all the weird legends about the occult they had heard about. I remember someone saying that if you walked back to a grave so many times it would raise the ghost of that person. They would do anything you said. Several weeks later, my family went to visit my grandparents. When my dad was a boy, my grandparents used to live on top of the mountain in a house that had been the birth and death place of 2 generations. My family even had a small graveyard near the house. While we were visiting them, my brother, sister, and a cousin decided to go up the mountain and look around the old home. Of course, we ended up in the graveyard. We were fooling around and reading the headstones when I remembered the legend that my classmate had told me about raising a dead person's ghost. I wanted to look cool, so I told the group about it. Of course, they laughed and thought I was silly for believing that tale. My brother wanted to really tease me, so he walked around the grave backward a number of times and said, "Go haunt Charlene." At first, I was scared and very upset with my brother. But as the day went on, nothing happened. I forgot about the incident. However, that night, I would be horribly reminded. The room I used to sleep in at my grandparents' place had 2 windows that were high above the ground. One faced the side of the mountain, and the other's view was obstructed by a large woodshed. That night, as I lay curled in my bed, I looked out the window to see something very unnerving. I saw 2 small bright lights, almost like miniature headlights, set an eye width apart, float past the window. I thought I was seeing things, so I looked up again, and they floated by again. I could not explain this to myself, no matter how hard I tried. The 2 windows were too high above the ground for it to be anyone walking by, and it couldn't be any reflection from a passing vehicle since there wasn't any going down the road at the time, and the 2 windows were pretty well blocked off. This occurrence continued to happen every time I went to visit my grandparents. Late at night, the 2 glowing eyes would float past the window. One time I even followed them from one window, then around the corner, past the other. Nighttime became a dreaded thing for me for years when I went to visit my grandparents. And no matter how hard I tried to tell my family about what was happening, they wouldn't believe me because it wouldn't happen when they were looking. Finally, my grandparents moved away, and thank goodness the thing didn't follow. I've learned my lesson. From now on, I will not fool with anything having to do with raising the spirits of the dead. If I hear anything else about it, I sure won't be telling my brother. Next story. This story was told to me by my mother. It took place in the back hills of West Virginia back in the late 1930s. My great-grandmother Judy and my grandmother Mary were canning vegetables. The house was set up that when you came into the side door you were in the kitchen. From the kitchen you could see into the dining room and then on into the living room. In the living room there was a huge fireplace. Around the fireplace were 7 rocking chairs where the family would sit and talk about the day's events after dinner. My great-grandfather, his brother, and their cousins all worked for the railroad, so Mary and Judy were the only ones home. They were walking back and forth from the kitchen to the dining room, placing the jars on the dining room table, when my grandmother yelled for Judy to come and look. My grandmother was standing in the dining room pointing into the living room at the rocking chairs, all rocking at the same tempo, all at the same time. All the windows and doors were shut, so there was no breeze in the house. Then all of a sudden they just stopped. They didn't slow down, they just stopped. Mary looked at the clock. It read 11:25. About 30 minutes later, my great uncle came running into the house yelling that my great grandfather had just been hit by a train. The time of death was around 11:30. Next story. My family lives in a very old house, 100 years old or maybe a few years less. Back in the day, people called it the Wheeler Mansion because it was the biggest house around. I'm not sure about what happened during its construction, but something happened in this house during the 1900s. Every day, there is more evidence of an uneasy presence in this house. We have everything that you have ever heard about. As far as entities, spirits, ghosts, orbs, we have it all. We've lived here for 3 years, and each day brings another reason to leave. Among the first encounters was a time when a girl about 14 or 15 years old was sitting on the bed of the oldest daughter. The really scary part is that she was only seeing the reflection of the TV in the next room. It seems her room had been the favorite of entities because she has heard distant conversations from what seems to be inside her westmost wall. The talking was ended by an abrupt scream, which only she heard. Later, while she was listening to music, her stereo volume went to the max all by itself. The remote had no batteries and the system was set up high on the other side of the room. When the situation was explained, it was thought that there was a volume problem at the radio station. But this theory was proven incorrect because the stereo showed the word volume for volume in 23, 24, 25 to the very max volume. What could have caused this? Several times our kitchen light switch turned the lights on and off. No one was around except for people on the other side of the room. There's an unusually large presence in the kitchen also. Our computer room is hooked onto our kitchen, and even now I feel like something or someone is watching me. That room has enormous energy, and that energy is obviously evil. For some reason, an entity has singled me out. I wake up at 3:13 on numerous occasions, sometimes night on end for weeks. Most of the time, I don't have any blankets on me at all when I wake up, and have very strange dreams, all of which are very dark and indistinct, very vague. Just now I've noticed numerous scratches on my hands, and I always seem to have stray bruises on my legs. I've discovered that entities are attracted to people who are introverted and depressed when stressed, and that is my personality completely. Just this evening, while up in the attic, I heard distinct children's laughter. To help to imagine this, my attic is very wide with low ceilings with beams. My attic has one light on the stairs which makes all the other places dark. At the 2 farthest ends of my attic, there are 2 long, narrow windows. At the side I was facing, my neighbor's spotlight shines in, making the windows seem white. At the time I heard laughing. I looked to where it came from, the side of the room with the bright windows. Since the window was the only distinct thing on that side of the attic, I looked at it. When I looked at it, I saw a profile of someone's face. It looked like they were sitting up, getting ready to stand. They sat up from the right to the left. As soon as I saw movement, I naturally ran. Next story. My stepbrother and his friend told me the story of a house that is located back in the woods in Pentress, just outside of Blacksville. They told me that this house is hundreds of years old. The story behind the house is that 13 children lived there with their mother and father. Somehow 11 of the children died in the house. No one knows how they died. I'm going to research on this, but I haven't been able to get around to it. But the story continues. There is no electricity in the area of the house because it sits about 3 miles back in the woods where there is now a cow pasture. People say they have seen lights on in the house. No one knows where they're coming from. My brother, while coon hunting one night, was on the ridge opposite of the house and looked over and saw it glowing. To this day, he will not go near the house. There were 13 windows that go across the front of the house, one for each child. My brother and I decided to go up one night. No lights were on, so we went inside the house. I searched for light sockets and everything, no sign of electricity. No light fixtures, no electric pole, nothing. In order to get into the house, you must go through the side kitchen door because the back porch has fallen in. I live very close to the house, so it's easy for me to go there. The second time I went to the house, I saw light coming from the kitchen window. It's not a bright light, but sort of an orange glow. Because the house sits so far back in the woods, you have to use a four-wheeler to get to it. On our way home, our four-wheeler stalled, and we could hear what sounded like someone walking while dragging chains. We eventually got the four-wheeler started and left. You must cross a barbed wire fence in order to get to the house. The third time I went, I saw no light, so I crossed the barbed wire fence and started walking towards the house. We were about to grab the handle to the kitchen door to enter the house, and the light in the kitchen came on. We all ran. On our way home, my brother saw a black figure with glowing red eyes sitting on the side of the road. On down the road, he saw a white figure standing in the middle of the road. The last time I went up, I took my aunt, who is big-time Christian. Me and my soon-to-be sister-in-law crossed the barbed wire fence and walked down to the house. The light was on in the kitchen, so we went back up the hill to the four-wheeler. My aunt didn't believe us, so we walked her down. She stared at the light through the windows for a while, and then she opened the kitchen door anyway. Inside, like kind of floating, right below the ceiling was one of those long, skinny bulbs. It had no fixtures around it. It was just floating there. It wasn't bright, like I said before. It was an orange glow. I haven't been to the house since, and I don't plan on going back. There are two siblings of the 13 children still alive, and they are my neighbors, but they will not talk about the house. Also, the woods that the house sits on are said to be haunted. My brother hunts in those woods and usually hunts until after dark. As they walked out at night, they can hear what sounds like someone walking behind them. There's also a silo that sits up on the hill close to the house. The story behind the silo is that a man was hung on the silo. After that, it is said that a group of the pagan bikers took a woman up there and beat, raped, and killed her. They say you can hear people scream, but I haven't heard anything. Next story. My mother, like many other West Virginians, was raised in a small two-bedroom coal camp house during the Depression. It was located in Long Branch, West Virginia. I know many people will be able to picture this from their own childhood homes. My mother slept in the back bedroom, which you entered from her parents' bedroom. Each night her parents would tuck her in and close the bedroom door, which was warped so it stuck and made a loud noise when you opened or closed it. Each night she'd be awakened by a man in miner's clothing gently rocking the edge of her bed with his two fists, but when she looked up to see his face, there was no visible head. She, of course, would scream loudly and he would vanish. Her parents would run in to see nothing there and would tell her it was just a bad dream. This went on for several nights when finally she asked her parents, "If it was a dream, then why was my door already open when you came in? And why didn't you hear it open?" From then on, she slept on the couch and never saw him again. In addition, as soon as another company house became available, her family moved. Next story. I can't remember the year, but my daughter was 15 and she's 26 now, so you do the math. But it was not a good year for us here in Yuma, Arizona. My daughter was just getting over serious illness and I was out of work. We had taken a vacation a year before to visit with my cousins in West Virginia. It was a great time, and they really wanted us to visit again. So we packed up. We had a great time and everyone was so wonderful that we decided to move from Arizona to West Virginia and kind of begin again. We began looking at houses before coming home to sell our house and pack. After much searching, we found a two-story home in a little town named Eleanor. It sat on about an acre with huge elm trees and a big area for a garden and the roses. The house was white with dark green trim. 2 stories with 4 bedrooms upstairs and a bathroom. A stairwell with a skylight and wonderful banisters. Downstairs was a huge kitchen, a bathroom, dining room, living room, and another bedroom with wood floors and beams. All for $30,000. No kidding. And besides, we all talked about how lonesome the house seemed and wanted us to move in and fix it. So we went home and packed all the dogs and cats and books and beds and moved 2,300 miles. We moved into the house in August. It's really sticky in West Virginia in August, and we didn't have AC, but as we started setting up housekeeping, we were sleeping in the downstairs bedroom because it was always cooler in there, even in the hot part of the day. We thought it was because it was over the cellar, walk under the house that had been dug out so you could get to the plumbing. We painted and carpeted, and everything was going fine. It was a mess to clean up, though. The house had been vacated for about 3 years, and before that, an invalid had lived in the house. We had to rip out all the carpeting from the upstairs before anything because someone used it as a bathroom at one time, and it was really gross, the stains especially in the small front room over the downstairs cool room that Nanny had picked for her bedroom. We cleaned up, and sparkling the house seemed to welcome us. But then some different fright sounds and smells began to come into our lives. First, let me tell you that all three of us are sensitive to some sights, sounds, and smells to a certain degree. Always have been and have seemingly made some adjustments. That is why I don't know why none of us really knew what was going on. It started with Nanny hearing a rocking chair in the living room at night. We didn't have one. Then Jennifer and I kept seeing shadows coming down the stairs as we sat in the living room. The bedroom stayed cold, and we had to put heavy curtains on the windows, hoping to keep out the drafts. We finally just used this room as storage. When my bedroom was, I could see across the upstairs landing to the door of Jennifer's room. I began seeing a shadow almost every night, pause outside the door and look in as though it were a parent that had come to check on a child that night. There was a nice, soft, and friendly feeling with her. Jennifer was also aware of the shadow. Then we began experiencing a smell from the downstairs bathroom. It smelled like a dead animal left out in the Arizona sun too long. We had some men come in and check the cellar crawl space for a toilet leak or maybe a dead skunk or cat. It was clean and dry. The smell only happened so often and seemed to last only 5 to 15 minutes, but we all smelled it, and so did others. We also experienced bright orbs and flits of light in and over the garden at night. No, they weren't fireflies. And we started having what we thought were health problems. Even though Jennifer was well, when we moved she seemed to relapse into a fugue state, not wanting to get out of bed. Even Nanny and I started having a lot of colds and the flu, where you just couldn't seem to get out of bed. We all loved to travel and visit, but all we did was stay in the house. Our animals even seemed to be in a slump. But how can you tell with cats that sleep 16 hours a day anyway? I was especially worried about my mom because she is a true A-type personality. Work, work, work. And now all she did was sleep or sit on the porch. We didn't even look for jobs, and we didn't have much money left. It was so unlike us. Then one night, Mom and I were in the living room, and Jin was upstairs in her room reading in bed. We heard Jin scream, and we ran up the stairs. She met us in the hall. She said something was trying to form in her room. She was reading and happened to look up into the corner. At first she thought it was a fire. A black cloud was forming in the corner. As she watched, almost in a daze, she seemed to see a body shape. When the head began to appear, she screamed and ran. She would not go back into the room, even to get her clothes. She moved in with me and Nanny, brave soul, that she brought out the clothes. Because we were running out of money and Jennifer's health was in another decline, we decided to come home to Arizona. We sold, gave away all our stuff, and with just as much personal items that we could get into the small U-Haul, plus the 4 cats and a dog. Later, we began to put all the feelings and things together, and the list grew and grew, much more than what I've given here. We finally, after 4 years, were able to sell the house, and now it's a type of office complex. I don't know if they've had any problems or not, and the truth be told, I really don't want to know. Next story. For many years, the Elkhorn ghost has made his presence known to a passerby as they either left or entered the mountain near the bridge. He is very tall, always wearing a red plaid jacket, blue jeans, and seems to usually appear on foggy nights. Everyone that usually spots him has their bright headlights on and notices that he is facing traffic, and when you see him, his face is a black void with no facial features distinguishable. Well, I admit, I've seen him several times, just like that, but it all changed on July 10th, 2000, around midnight. My husband and I had just got through visiting his mom and brother after returning from our honeymoon when we decided to take the shortcut to Elkhorn Mountain to go home to Bluefield rather than go through Welch. I stopped at the intersection to go to Elkhorn Mountain at the bridge to see if it was clear to turn, and he appeared to us. He was walking from the Anawalt Way and stopped walking when he saw us. I recognized at once that it was him from his clothes, and I told my husband that it was him. His legs were transparent, and he had some type of hunting cap atop his head, sort of like a winter cap. Also, he had a brown paper bag which appeared to have a liquor bottle in it, and when he looked at us, his facial features were more distinguishable. He appeared to have a beard, but his eyes were empty black voids. To this day, I don't know what anyone else has seen him like we did, or if he still just appears with his face like a black void. Who knows? If you happen to travel to Elkhorn Mountain on a foggy night, then you might see the Elkhorn ghost. Next story. This happened back around 2004. I was a respiratory therapist at Beckley Appalachian Hospital. It was around 10:30 at night, and I was waiting to do a procedure on a patient in a room at the end of the hallway. I was standing in the hallway facing towards the center of the hospital talking with one of the nurses who was facing the opposite direction. Well, from the corner of my eye, I saw a man standing in the doorway of the room I was waiting to enter. So I assumed it was my patient who was trying to tell me he was ready for his test, but as I turned, I heard footsteps and the man was gone. I looked at the nurse and asked her if anyone was standing in the doorway. She said no one was there, but she had heard footsteps. We both checked surrounding rooms and found all the patients were in bed and had been there for a while. The really creepy part is that I could make out details about this person, like he was wearing a green hospital gown and looked just like a man that had passed away in that room several months ago. My only explanation, that it was an ex-patient that came to say hello. Next story. The 29th Street area in Wheeling was at one time nicknamed Germantown due to its high number of people with a Germanic descent. My family is from this area. All the way from the Ohio River out the pike, one can walk down 29th Street and hear stories of hauntings in almost every other house. One such house was my aunt's house. This was the original family house that my grandfather purchased. It's not on 29th Street, but runs parallel to it just one block south. The first thing one notices about the house is that it is the only one that sits back off the street, therefore shrouded in shadow by the tall houses on either side of it. Along an even brick walkway takes you to the house. As you walk along it, the feeling of being unwelcome is almost overpowering. Once you're inside, you're aware that you're being watched and scrutinized with every step you take. There were several children in my aunt's family. Some lived out long lives, others died prematurely. She used to say that the family always came back to the house. My aunt used to tell me of times past and of old customs. She told me that it was proper to have the deceased laid out in the living room instead of a funeral home. She told me that at one time it was legal to bury the deceased in your own yard. She also told me that the dead always return. My uncle JR was the firstborn of my aunt's siblings. As a child, his favorite toy was a red lantern. He fell down the narrow steps. He died a few days later. JR would come back to visit every night on the anniversary of his death. One would hear a strange tapping on the window at the bottom of the stairs, then a red lantern would glow softly. I didn't believe it. I was openly skeptical. My aunt begged me to visit on a certain night. I did. My aunt, my father, and I sat in the kitchen. They had their coffee and I had some soda. After a while, we heard the faint tapping. My aunt took me into the room, and there it was before my own eyes, a red lantern glowing crimson and swinging ever so gently, but evenly back and forth. The three of us stood there watching it for a few moments. Then my aunt said, "Welcome home, JR. Thanks for the visit. Come again next year. Enjoy your rest." Then it faded. Not long after this, we were visiting once again. My parents and my aunt sat in the kitchen, and I was sitting in the living room watching the television. After a while, I got up and went to chat with everyone else. I mentioned that I liked my aunt's new rocking chair. She told me she didn't have a rocking chair. I described it. She and my father looked at each other. She then looked at the calendar and just nodded. I went back into the living room, but the rocker was gone. On the way home, my dad explained that that was my grandmother's chair and that day was the anniversary of her death. Strangely, these two things didn't bother me. They freaked me out, but didn't really frighten me. The next sighting Did though. I was visiting and I needed to use the bathroom, which is upstairs. I started up the very same stairs where JR fell. I stopped, looked up, and there before I stood the outline of a man. Within it, or maybe I should say through it, everything was distorted. It reminded me of the movie Predator when it was invisible. This was not JR. I never met the man, but I could tell. I could feel the anger. I was unwelcome. The upstairs always gave me the creeps, but after this encounter I never stepped foot in the stairwell again. I told my brother about the encounter and he said that he had the exact same thing happen to him and that is why he never went back to the house. There are more stories of objects that appear in the house and things that have moved. However, they are similar in tale, books, paintings, mirrors. There was another visit that I find important. My oldest brother bought a house just 2 doors away from my aunt. His grandsons live with him. Once my brother heard his grandson playing and talking to some guy in his bedroom. My brother asked whom he was talking to. The young boy pointed to a picture hanging on the wall, and it was my father. My stepsister didn't believe it at first, and then she found her bra in the freezer. That sounds like something my dad would have done when he was alive. When did this happen? 3 years to the day after my dad passed away. This is one more story that tops them all, but it's still very personal and maybe one day I will reveal it. The thought of it still raises the hair on my arms and neck and makes me reach for a crucifix. Of all the original siblings in the house, only 4 are still living. My aunt is now in a rest home. The house sits there empty and waiting. Next story. July 1992. Near midnight, rural Pocahontas County, Seabird Road. A friend and I, along with a lifeguard from the swimming pool at Watauga State Park, were returning to the campground at the park after driving to Marlinton for some late night snacks. Earlier in the day, I'd lost my car keys in the Greenbrier River, so the lifeguard set us up with a campsite at the park and offered to drive us to town for supplies until I could get a key for my car made the next day. It was near midnight when we turned off US 219 onto lonely Seabird Road to head to the park entrance. The Park of West Virginia is mighty rural and Seabird is no exception. It was foggy that night as well when I saw one of the most bizarre things I've ever witnessed. A field with a fence row is on the right side of the road as you head towards Watauga and tiny Seabird, which sits along the Greenbrier River. As we were driving, less than a mile off Route 219 along that road, a very tall, almost glowing figure of a man suddenly rose from the ground next to the fence post. The man didn't stand up as one would from a lying position, but rather sprang straight up, without bending his knees, in a perfect arch, similar to the way Dracula rises out of his casket in the 1990s film Bram Stoker's Dracula, but much faster. Once he was in a standing position, this man stared intently at our car as we drove past, turning only his head to follow the car. He made no other movements and didn't attempt to follow. The figure was at least 6.5 feet tall, bald, and had an eerie halo-like glow around his entire body, and almost reflected in the fog. His body was self-illuminated and not an image caused by the car's headlights. I know this because the figure was looking right at me as we drove by, well out of headlight range. One very distinctive feature I remember was that he was bald, and the stare from his eyes was incredibly intense. Just as we passed the figure, all 3 in the car looked at each other and said, "Did you see what I just saw now?" We all did. We today still confirm that was no human figure. It would have been impossible for anyone to rise from a supine position in that fashion. It's pretty much creeped us all out. Chills on the back of the neck kind of thing. But can you blame us? Next story. I know this may be hard to believe, and I used to be a non-believer, so to speak, but this honest to goodness swear upon a Bible happened to my husband and me. When I was 17, we moved from Cross Lanes to Elkview due to the death of my father. We didn't have much of anything due to legalities, but my mom, brother, and I found this awful run-down, older house trailer in frame. It was infested with mice, old, and I hated it. One day I found what looked like a deep, rust, brownish-reddish stain in the bathroom around the floor vent that looked like it had soaked into the linoleum. There was also what looked like a handprint that had stained the area too on the back of the door near the vent and floor. Upon talking to the neighbors, I was told that a woman had been raped and murdered in the place. Okay, like that was not freaky enough. My mom decided it was not true and advised me to do the same. Well, it was not quite so easy. One night I was home by myself on my phone in my small room with my back to the hallway, looking into my mirror, just chatting away. I noticed a small white glowing ball that was somewhat transparent and about the size of a quarter in the corner of my mirror which faced the hallway. I turned around, looked into the hall, and watched it move from the top of the corner of the hall down to my mom's room at the end of the hallway. I was totally freaking out, but I followed it. I was at my mom's bedroom door and it seemed to float to the ceiling to the corner of her bedroom. Then suddenly, like one pulls a flashlight away from the ceiling, and it gets to be a big round light on the wall, which is what this did. It got big and faint, then just seemed to suck into the corner of the ceiling. It disappeared. I was screaming and yelling. Mom came home, and my friend on the phone thought I was losing it. I was chalked up to being stressed and tired by everyone. Of course, no one believed me. Also, keep in mind the timer. The really old ones that buzz on our stove never worked. We had a few people that our electricians looked to fix it, but never could. It was a really old stove. Now fast forward 3 months down the road. We're moving out to a better place, and although I never stayed there alone again or said anything to anyone, I always had a feeling. I can't even describe it. Maybe I was crazy. Until my now husband was moving in. That is how we met. He came to look at the place to rent before we moved out, and we eventually got together. Well, he started having the strangest things happen to him. Now I realize my husband is Mr. Cynical, outdoorsy, manly man kind of guy, so he thought he never believed anything like that. He now thought he was going crazy too. I never once mentioned anything to him about my encounter. It so happens that one day he called me freaking out. He slept in a waterbed in what used to be my mom's room. He wanted to know if I had been to his house while he was sleeping. I said no, I hadn't. And he also called everyone he knew and no one had been there. It just so happens that his digital alarm clock that sits at the head of his bed was sitting at the foot of his bed on the bed rail flashing the time, but it was unplugged. I was beginning to think I wasn't crazy. I then told him my experience in the supposed rumor of the murder. Then one night, I'd stayed the night with him and it happened again. The alarm clock had been moved and was doing the same thing. I know no one had been in the house. Then things would happen like the lamps fading in and out, off and on, and most importantly, remember the stove timer buzzer that didn't work? Well, we were awakened at 1 a.m. to the thing buzzing like crazy. We ran into the kitchen and come to find out the pilot light had gone out on all four burners and was leaking gas into the house. It was almost as if it was warning us. He ended up leaving and also finding a better place to live. At least, we know that we weren't both crazy. But it never seemed to hurt us or be mean. Whatever it was just, I don't know, there. I know this sounds crazy, but after that experience, both my husband and I are not cynics anymore.